Live.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition with another episode of The Energy Show. This is Evan Zimmerman, Vice President of UPEC, with my co-host, Horst Schmidt, UPEC President. And tonight we are presenting Jennifer McKay of the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. And tonight's subject is Line 5, Where Do We Stand Now? And how your vote affects Michigan's environment this year.
Well,
Horst.
thank you for coming on tonight. We really appreciate it. And as Evan pointed out, we have two topics. One is how things are going at the present time with Line 5. And there have been a number of news stories in the past few weeks, I think, that would merit attention, and we'll be talking about those. And then we'll switch over to voting. We're not going to just tell you how you can vote, but we'll talk about subjects that relate to voting. So Jennifer, before we start, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and you know, the thing that interests most people is how did you get started?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on tonight. Glad to be here. My name is Jennifer McKay. I'm the Policy Director at Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Watershed Council is a nonprofit organization. We are based in Petoskey, Michigan. So we're below the bridge. We basically work to, our mission is to restore, protect, and enhance the water resources of Michigan, which includes wetlands, rivers, streams, lakes, Great Lakes, and our groundwater. And we work to maintain the environmental integrity and economic and aesthetic values of those waters. You know, I got involved in Line 5 because, well, we sort of sit at our service area is the Tip of the Mitt. So we basically are ground zero for Line 5 at the Straits of Mackinac, but also Line 5 crosses directly through our service area. So years ago, we got involved with Line 5, and since then, I served on the Michigan Pipeline Safety Advisory Board, being appointed by former Governor Rick Snyder. I also serve on the Emmett County Local Emergency Planning Committee and the Northern Michigan Area Committee, both of which work on emergency response for Line 5. I've participated in live exercises with Enbridge, the EPA, the Coast Guard, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, otherwise known as EAGLE, and the first responders. So I've been heavily involved in Line 5 for a number of years in a variety of ways.
Okay, Jennifer, we've got a lot of territory to cover, and I think maybe the best place to start is to tell our audience what's going on with the court cases, because they still are there, and I'm sure that we'll be talking about them in the future. So where are we on Attorney General's lawsuit to close down the line?
Well, there were two court cases that the Attorney General was involved with. One was filed by Enbridge, which challenged the constitutionality of what is known as PA 359, which was the legislation that was passed during the lame duck session that basically allowed for the tunnel construction. The Michigan Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Enbridge in that case, and Attorney General Nessel decided not to pursue that case to the Supreme Court in Michigan. But at the same point in time, we do have another court case pending in which the Attorney General is seeking to have the pipeline shut down. That's in the Ingham County Circuit Court, where Line 5 is, the case is basically where Line 5 is deemed a public nuisance, and it creates an unreasonable risk where it threatens grave environmental harm and catastrophic harm to the public rights and the public trust waters, which is Lake Michigan and Huron. That lawsuit was originally filed on June 27th of 2019, and it seeks an immediate shutdown after reasonable notice, and then a permanent decommissioning of Line 5. So that lawsuit is still going on. So we'll see the results of that. I presume should the Attorney General be successful, Enbridge will of course appeal that decision, and it will continue in the courts for a number of years, I presume.
Jennifer, the Straits of Mackinac Group has also filed a lawsuit. Has that been settled?
So they were challenging the anchor permit that was granted to Enbridge. So Enbridge has to have the line in the pipeline in the Straits anchored or on the bottom of the Great Lakes every 75 feet, and to be in accordance with the easement that was issued in 1953. And so the Straits Mackinac Alliance challenged the permit, and they went to court, and the judge ruled that partly in their favor and partly not, that they could argue certain aspects, basically that the anchors could harm the bottomlands of the Great Lakes. And at this point in time, I believe that the Straits of Mackinac Alliance has decided not to continue to pursue that lawsuit.
Okay. So something you mentioned earlier was the fact that we're still awaiting the DNR's research on the 1953 easement agreement. Is that is what they're researching, correct?
Correct. So in 1953, the state of Michigan did an easement with what was Lakehead Pipelines at the time, but is now Enbridge. And possible violations of the easement are just one of several grounds in which the state could seek shutdown of the pipelines. And so Governor Whitmer ordered the Department of Natural Resources to conduct a thorough review of that 1953 easement last June of 2019, after her negotiations with Enbridge fell through. And the company filed the lawsuit with the state. So the agreement basically, the easement basically says Enbridge has to comply with a number of terms and conditions to ensure the protection of the Straits of Mackinac and the waters that are held in public trust for the citizens of Michigan. So the DNR has completed their review, and currently it is sitting within the governor. So she has to do a final review. If the DNR finds that Enbridge has in fact violated the easement, then that could warrant a termination of that agreement. And Whitmer has full authority to do that. Essentially, she could revoke that easement and Enbridge's right to operate the pipelines in the Straits of Mackinac. So we are awaiting the governor to finish her review and to come out with the final decision on that, because that essentially is another way in which the pipeline could potentially be shut down.
Well, we can assume that Enbridge is not going to take this, and there'll be appeals, and probably the state Supreme Court, and perhaps even the U.S. Supreme Court is a possibility, right?
I'm sure Enbridge would appeal, but there are known violations. So Enbridge has admitted to violations. The former governor, Rick Snyder, sent notices of violation on both the 75-foot spans. We know of coding violations. In fact, part of the DNR easement review was released to the public regarding financial liability. The AG released it, and it shows that the Enbridge Energy Limited Partnership, which is the U.S. subsidiary to the Enbridge Inc. Canadian company. So Enbridge Energy Limited Partnership, which owns and operates the portion in Michigan, does not have the ability to cover the financial liability for a worst case discharge in the Straits of Mackinac. The state commissioned a risk analysis to determine what that liability would be, and it came back at essentially $1.9 billion. And this analysis done as part of this review determined that because it was only the U.S. subsidiaries that signed an agreement with the state, that these U.S. subsidiaries cannot cover that. That only the U.S. or only Enbridge Inc., the Canadian company can. So the DNR asked Enbridge if they would address this and get the Enbridge Inc. parent company in Canada to sign a document saying we will cover spills up to the $1.9 billion. And to date, they have refused to do so. So I think once this comes out, there will be issues that warrant at least revoking the easement, to be honest.
Well, you know, we're going to go into an area that's of recent interest in that. Matter of fact, the last couple of days, there was an article that the administrative law judge for the Michigan Public Service Commission said that he would not do any investigation outside of the tunnel itself, so no environmental issues would be touched by him. And you know, when you read it, it sounds you know, unbelievable that he can't do that. I'm assuming he has a legal basis for it, and we need to you know, I think have some understanding. What is he actually going to be ruling on?
So it's a bit confusing on what he's ruling on. So with the Michigan Public Service Commission, Enbridge sought to limit evidence in that permit process and prevent the commission from considering a number of aspects, including the construction of the tunnel itself, the environmental impact of the tunnel construction, the public need for and continued operation of Line 5, the current operation and safety of Line 5, and climate change. Judge Mack, who was the judge in that case, ruled that climate and other environmental impacts from the current operation of the pipeline are outside the scope of the Michigan Public Service Commission's jurisdiction. That being said, Judge Mack did rule that the utility tunnel itself falls under the review of the commission, because the utility tunnel serves basically an essential function in that it is the pipelines dependent upon and inseparable from the tunnel itself. So because the tunnel serves a number of functions as with respect to being a protective layer, secondary containment, foundation for the pipeline itself, that the commission does get to rule upon the tunnel. And with that, the commission does get to look at the public need and the design of the tunnel. And they do get to look at the environmental impacts of the tunnel under the Michigan Environmental Protection Act. So they can look at the pollution and impairment, destruction of the water resources, as well as if there's a feasible and prudent alternative to the tunnel. What we were hoping for, the Watershed Council is an intervener in the Michigan Pipeline Service Commission case, was a broader scope. We believe that the current and future operation of the entirety of Line 5 needs to be considered in this case. Obviously, when the tunnel and pipeline are replaced, that means that Line 5 in its entirety will continue to operate for essentially up to 99 years, which is the lease that's being proposed. And so that's our concern, is the public necessity for the pipeline for 99 years, as well as the environmental impacts along the entire infrastructure, as well as climate change impacts when our governor and our state are trying to move away from fossil fuels. So does that make sense? Is that the judge did rule that we can look at environmental impacts of the tunnel itself, but not the entire pipeline infrastructure.
So this is Judge Mack that you're talking about, correct?
Yes, Judge Mack.
So he's giving a little more latitude than the news story indicated?
Yes. There, obviously the commission under their rules has the ability to consider, and they're required to consider MIPA for the review of the pipeline and the tunnel, which he said was under their authority. But what he said was not under their authority is the current pipeline. So Line 5 as it currently sits in the Straits of Mackinac, or the rest of the infrastructure in Michigan, which we were hoping to be considered as part of the case, because obviously the pipeline or the tunnel will take a number of years to construct. And as it's being constructed, obviously we continue to have the risk of the current pipelines being exposed on the bottomlands, and we've had anchor strikes and a number of factors, as well as, again, the fact that the entire pipeline infrastructure being extended for another 99 years poses a number of risks to not only the Great Lakes, but it crosses 400 waterways throughout Michigan.
Right, and also they've had over 1 million gallons of oil spills over the 20 years.
They've had a number of inland spills over the years.
Okay.
29 spills since 1968.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think I saw that the pipeline actually was owned by a company called Spectrum, and up to about 2002. Is that correct?
So it was owned by Lakehead, and Lakehead became Enbridge. So Enbridge merged with a gas company, and now Enbridge owns a number of gas pipelines throughout the United States. So if you've seen media reports lately, you've seen probably a number of reports of gas explosions in pipelines associated with Enbridge. And that is because they did a merger with a gas company.
Mhm. Well, also, I believe they've been buying pipeline companies that have older pipelines, and which is a concern, just as it is with Line 5. So it seems like we have an infrastructure that is going to create more problems in the future than would be if they were built new at this point in time. So I'm wondering, if you've got this 67-year-old pipeline, you've also got other old pipelines coming, from Canada, and we're going. I'm trying to think. They have a newer one, the Line 6B, right? Is that the one that ruptured and created that million-gallon spill, I guess? So, but that was a newer pipeline, right?
It was newer than Line 5. That is correct.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has been very interesting is the experts have been saying, that this is a gambit by Enbridge to just buy time not to build a tunnel. And the question is, if they're going to all this trouble and they're trying to make this money off of this pipeline, none of it makes sense, does it?
I mean, so they've spent a lot of money towards this tunnel. They've applied for multiple permits. We just ended 2 public comment periods, well, 3, with the state of Michigan. So they just applied for permits under what is called Part 325 for impacts to the Great Lakes bottomland, Part 303 impacts to wetlands. They applied for what is called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or what is commonly known as the NIPDES permit. Those decisions actually by the state of Michigan are expected in November and December. So they're actively pursuing permits for the tunnel projects. They're moving forward with the project. Whether it gets approved or not, we're at a critical juncture right now. The MPSC decision will not come until mid next year. But they should know about some other permits here very quickly.
We haven't heard anything from the Army Corps of Engineers on their part of the tunnel project. I'm assuming they're just evaluating at this point, or they're waiting for the state to finish its review of the plans. Is that the way it's working right now?
So the Army Corps of Engineers public period ended before the state. And they actually do not expect to have a decision until early next year. And one of the things that they need to consider that has actually come out more recently is cultural resources. Under their rules and regulations, they have to consider cultural resources. And we now know through a letter that was found, as well as some work that was done by some tribal citizens, that there may be some very significant cultural resources that could be damaged by the tunnel project in the Straits of Mackinac. We're talking cultural resources that are 10,000 to 8,000, you know, years before, and it's
Well,
between
you know,
the
what's interesting is that most people don't realize that at one time the straits were much more shallow, and you know, when we're talking about the tunnel and they're talking about this going down to 371 feet to get underneath, there's an old river channel that's in there. And so when they found those stones that seemed to represent some kind of settlement, and I think it was somewhere around 80 to 100 feet below current water surface. So you know, from what I've seen in past in the geological work that's been done, you'll I don't know if you've seen the graphic depictions of how the lakes keep shifting over the let's see, multi-millennial times, you know, and then one time, for example, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, one lake, you know, that kind of thing. So it's really interesting when you start studying this, and then you realize the significance of it, because here are these people who you thought wouldn't be there because there's nothing there, but there is. You know, they actually found a way to you know, live and thrive in that at that time. So that's what, you know, that's important. And of course, then the other thing I think we want to briefly touch on is the fact that this is where the tribes have problems with the different what we call it, development schemes that don't really take their heritage seriously. And I think that's really the you know, the point I want to make, because you know, is that they have sovereignty, but I kind of call it sovereignty that's more like Swiss cheese, you know, because there's so many holes in them that they can ignore them or they can, you know, go with them. So do you have any thoughts on some of this you know, problem that the tribes have getting their concerns taken seriously? And of course, let's not forget the hunting and fishing rights. That's just a big thing with the tunnel construction, as well as the potential for an oil spill.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you know, we have a number 5 out of 12 tribes are part of the 1838 treaty that reserved off-reservation treaty rights. And in the heart of that is Straits of Mackinac. And so they absolutely have treaty rights that need to be completely respected, and you know, they're supposed to have tribal consultation on all of these projects that might impact their treaty rights. And I will say I have talked to the tribes, and I don't want to speak for them. Let me make that very clear. I don't want to speak for them, but based upon what I have been told, the tribal consultations have been more of a check the box process by the agencies, rather than an actual consultation where their opinion and their tribal their tribal history and culture is actually taken into consideration and validated throughout the process. So I do think that is a very significant problem we have, not only with this project, but with a lot of projects that go on in Michigan. But when we have obviously cultural resources that we know might potentially be there, I think it's time for us to step back and take a look at what is actually there and confirm, confirm what is there or what is not there, and then 2, make sure that any action that is taken will not damage Michigan's past. We can't simply just brush aside our past and destroy our cultural history.
Thank you. I think that's so important.
Someone-
Could you take a quick question from our audience? Jeff Towner has a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Evan. Jennifer, thanks for being here. I'm a UPEC board member, and I just had one comment and a couple questions for you. As background, I used to work for this very Corps of Engineers regulatory program for about 20 years, including in Detroit District. So, you know, they, as I think you have pointed out, they have an obligation to consult with the tribes. And if they don't do a serious good faith consultation, I think they're opening themselves up for a big legal challenge. And just a couple questions on the NIPIDs permits you mentioned. Is that for the bentonite waste discharge, wastewater discharge? You know?
That is one of the discharges. So it is for obviously, so during the tunneling process, they're going to be, Enbridge is proposing to withdraw water from the straits and use it during the tunneling process. And they will obviously be using bentonite during that process. So they'll have the tunneling waste with the bentonite. They also have stormwater. They also have a couple other different waste products that they will be treating and then discharging into Lake Michigan. Okay.
Yeah, and so is that all coming under one NIPIDs permit, do you know?
Yes, it is all coming under one NIPD's permit, including the hydrostatic testing. So prior to a pipeline being allowed to operate, they have to do a hydrostatic test, which means they basically pressurize the pipeline with water greater than the pipeline is allowed to operate at. And that water will also falls under that NIPD's permit.
Okay, okay. That's good information. And also on another thing on the Corps of Engineers process, I heard you mention that they are anticipating having a decision early next year. And I submitted comments, and a number of us submitted comments, and I haven't been following the process very closely, admittedly. But you know, one of the things that I requested, well, two things I requested in my comments was a public hearing, at least one public hearing. Actually, I asked for a public hearing on both sides of the straits, and also recommended that they do an EIS, because I've been through that process many, many times on other projects. And in my mind, there's no question but that this project requires a full EIS. And I don't know if you've heard anything about the level of NEPA document they're doing, but if they were going to do an EIS, I don't see any way that they could finish it early next year. So if they're anticipating a decision coming up that soon, that kind of tells me maybe they're not doing an EIS.
So first, let me thank you very much for the request for a hearing in EIS. I requested the same thing. And I have not heard from them on either. But the comments I have heard from them is a decision is coming early next year. So I have the same thought you had, is that they do not plan on doing either a public hearing or a full EIS.
Okay. And that's coming from the Corps and not Enbridge.
Correct.
Okay. Very
Jeff,
interesting.
I've got a question for you. With your experience with the process, but what would trigger an EIS? And people need to know that's an environmental impact statement.
Right. And under NEPA, an EIS is required for any activity that is likely to cause a significant impact to the human environment. That's the definition for an EIS, for what triggers an EIS. If it's a project that has no more than minimal impacts, then they can do an environmental assessment, which is a much shorter, less complicated process. So, you know, if that's the standard, and you think about tunneling this huge tunnel underneath the Straits of Mackinac, and then placing all this infrastructure in there and running, you know, oil through that tunnel, as well as broadband and whatever else they're putting in there, I don't think most reasonable people would say that's not a significant impact. And I think if in my personal opinion, if the Corps tries to do that with an EA, they are just painting a big target on themselves for a legal challenge.
And I would agree with you. And you obviously commented on the permit. And if you read Enbridge's application, they painted a picture that they are having very little environmental impacts.
Of course they are.
So.
Of course.
You know, what's interesting is Ed Tim, who's the engineer that I've heard a couple of times, mentioned in his last talk that they're asking for major problems because basically you're putting the tunnel into a V, and if anything goes wrong, everything you know can fall apart or explode or implode because of that. And another thing that that you incidentally mentioned, Jeff, which is that they want to put you know, utilities into the tunnel. And Ed mentioned that that's asking for trouble because you have the issue of static electricity, which could create you know, a big explosion. You could probably see it come out of both ends in the two areas. So that's, you know, something that I wasn't aware of. You know, when this whole process started with the Army and then with Eagle's permits, I had no idea that these were all things that had to be considered, and basically the applications, according to Mr. Tim and I think the other two experts that Oil and Water had, indicate that they're missing so much of it. And so you wonder, you know, as I raised the issue earlier, how serious are they? I mean, I'm not asking you guys to answer it. I'm just raising the question. So that's you know, just important. So anyway, do we have any more questions or comments from anyone, Evan?
One thing I'd like to know is how common it is for a company not to be willing to cover the liability for their spills. That seems like that shouldn't be allowed to happen ever.
So Enbridge will tell you they have agreed to cover the liability. So they have said that in the agreement between Enbridge and the state, it says that it says Enbridge Energy Limited Partnership and any subsidiaries or any, I don't know the language exactly, I'm sorry, but basically any of their other partners. So they think they have held their part of the deal by basically agreeing to any of their other partners. In addition, there is what is called the Oil Pollution Act, which basically requires any oil spill to be covered by the entity that spills the oil, although it only goes to a certain extent. So when you look at the Kalamazoo River spill, it was the most expensive oil spill in the US, inland oil spill, let me clarify, inland oil spill in the US. And Enbridge has spent $1.2 billion on that cleanup. And they will use that as an example that they're willing to pay and cover expenses.
But Enbridge
Oh,
Inc.,
that's
who has the money, has refused.
Evan.
But still, despite all of this, wordplay about, who has the responsibility here, Enbridge Inc. has refused. The Enbridge Inc., who has the money to cover it, not the American subsidiary, has refused to cover the liability. And that just doesn't, if anyone is going to say that they believe in this project and they're willing to cover it, you would think it would be the parent company, but no, if even they don't have faith in it, who should?
Yeah, correct. The parent company refuses to sign a document with the state of Michigan to cover the 1.9 billion. Absolutely. Which, they have the money, and it should be a no-brainer for them to sign it, but they were refusing to sign it.
I think we've come to the end of our subject tonight. Do you have any closing comments on this part of our show, Jennifer?
I stay involved. There's a lot going on. Obviously, we're going to have some decisions coming out soon. The Michigan Public Service Commission is accepting comments throughout the entire time. Thank you for submitting comments to the Corps, and hopefully we get a hearing, we get an EIS. It's going to be a long process, but hopefully we get some decisions that go our way. And yeah, stay tuned.
Well, thank you on that part. I think we want to get into the next part, which is about voting, which is, I don't know, I guess they're not even comparable, but we need them both in order to make it all work, right? And so Jennifer is going to give us a little rundown on what's happening right now in terms of how to vote and when to vote, and which is not as easy a question to answer as you would think. And just give us a quick run through on the voting process right now, and then we'll get into some issues that would reflect the need for voting.
Well, just really quickly, as a 501c3 nonprofit, the Watershed Council can't support or oppose candidates or political parties. So I just got to say that we can educate candidates and voters, and we do that. Voting is the most important way that you can voice your opinion in how elected officials protect our water resources and our environment. And it's every office on the ballot, from mayors to president. All of them have the opportunity to influence our Great Lakes and our water resources once they're in office. And to protect the lakes, we need to defend existing clean water laws, which have been threatened. Why we need to push for stronger, better protections. And we need to ensure that everyone across the Great Lakes has access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. So, there's a number of things as we're coming up on the elections. If you still haven't voted, there's a couple things. One is, there's a Great Lakes Voting Center. It was developed by the Alliance for the Great Lakes. It's a phenomenal tool. There, you can get information on checking your voter registration status. Michigan actually does allow same day voter registration, meaning you can register the same day, on the same day as the election. You can learn about your candidates on your local ballot. And if you want, you can also reach out to your candidates and try and get questions answered specifically to water resources, which I always recommend. You can find your local polling station. And if you're going to vote in person, I suggest you check your polling location a number of times, because with COVID-19, health concerns can change polling locations or lead to a reduced number of polling places in some communities. So make sure you check that. And then we have mail-in and absentee ballots, which is what the majority of people are doing in Michigan right now. Michigan has expanded absentee ballot voting as an alternative. All Michigan residents have the ability to vote via absentee ballot. Let's see. They need to be turned in by sorry, I want to make sure I get this correct. Completed absentee voter ballots must be received by 8 p.m. on November 3rd. And there was a court case that went to the Court of Appeals that they will not be accepting late ballots in Michigan. So you want to make sure you get that ballot in. It's recommended now that we're so close. Don't use the mail. You should actually drop it off in person. Couple of tips you should do. Be sure to sign and date the return envelope. If you don't sign it, it'll be rejected and won't be counted. Make sure you follow all the instructions. If you make a mistake, again, it won't be counted. Make sure the ballot is inside. There's a security envelope. Make sure the ballot is inside it. It seems obvious, but if not, it won't be counted. You can check the status of your ballot if it was accepted or not. I did it. It's kind of cool. You can do it at the Michigan Voter Information Center or voteamerica.com. So the Michigan Voter Information Center is through our Secretary of State. So mvic.sos.state.mi.us. Basically, if you go to our Secretary of State, you can find it. Just make sure you follow all the instructions on the absentee ballot. And it's fascinating because, Horst sent me an article that the number of absentee ballots throughout the state, they're up, but in the Upper Peninsula, in the 6 largest counties, they're up by more than 300%. That was impressive.
It is. Do you know if people can change their mind and go in right up through 8 o'clock on November 3rd? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. They can.
So, I mean, it'll probably not make the township clerk happy, but will definitely give people an opportunity to decide whether or not they want to really vote yes or no on, let's say like on Proposition 1, which is about the Michigan DNR trust fund, which is a confusing issue. So maybe do you want to, you and I want to talk a little bit about it, because it took me a while to figure the thing out, because it's not the clearest thing in the world. And then also what's interesting on this is that some environmental organizations are divided on this issue, and which was really interesting. And you wonder if the ones who are against it have read the whole thing, and understood it, or are we talking about some kind of alarmist issue that's coming up? And I don't, we're just talking issues. We're not talking, yes or no to the vote. But I think it's a good example of when you're a citizen, you really have to take voting seriously, and really have to look at what you're voting for.
Yeah, we can talk Prop 1. So the Watershed Council has fully endorsed Prop 1, which basically lifts the cap on the Natural Resources Trust Fund. For decades, the Natural Resources Trust Fund has been protecting drinking water sources, wildlife habitat, outdoor spaces, by receiving oil and gas royalties and directing them towards land acquisition and public recreation projects. All 83 counties across Michigan have benefited. However, the trust fund reached its cap in 2011. So the royalties are now directed to the State Park Endowment Fund, to fund land acquisition for state parks and maintenance, operations, capital improvements, state parks. But that has a cap too. So basically, Proposal 1 will remove the cap on the trust fund, allowing it to again to receive revenues from the royalties of oil, gas, and mining. And once that the State Park Endowment Fund reaches a cap, it safeguards the constitutionality, protecting revenue sources for conservation and recreation for future generations. It also adds renovation and redevelopment for public recreation facilities as an allowable use. So it allows communities to reinvest in aging recreation infrastructure in addition to creating new facilities. And it requires at least 25% of the trust fund reimbursements to be made available for that development, renovation, redevelopment, and to match the minimum 25% for land acquisition and protection.
When you're on the DNR Citizens Advisory Council, you get to hear the reports from the managers on what's happening. And up here, there have been two big problems recently. One is McLean State Park, which is on the wrong side of the breakwater, so it's losing sand, and then the wind and rain create a major erosion problem, so they had to rebuild the park. The other one, of course, is the highway that leads up to the Porkies, right around where the ranger station is, was in danger of being totally undermined, which would have basically isolated the park on the east end, and of course would have kept people from going up to the Lake of the Clouds up there. So these are the kinds of maintenance issues that I'm aware of, and something as simple as putting a new roof on the ski chalet in the Porkies is another issue. So I think from what I've been hearing over the past few years is that their revenue streams have been pretty stable or declining, depending upon which area it is. Hunting has been going down. The passport program, which you buy when you register your automobile, is the revenue is up. But overall, when we consider the huge size of our park system in the state, I don't see how they can keep going without having an increase in revenue, because with climate change, it's going to be even worse if you think about it, because we've had at least 2 or 3 major events along the north shore of Lake Superior in the last 6 to 8 years. So that's really one way of looking at it. But anyway, I don't want to advocate any more than I have to. So what other issues do you think make a difference if people are voting and taking it seriously?
Well, I mean, you always want to, from the Watershed Council, we look at water resources issues. And there are a number of, issues that we did a candidate survey and we asked our representatives about. We asked them about climate change. We asked them about, invasive species and Asian carp. We asked them about water infrastructure, because that's huge right now, with a number of the state not having access to clean drinking water. So you can always look at what their positions are on those issues. You just mentioned climate change is going to have a huge impact on the park system up north. What are the candidates' positions on climate change? That actually is that can tell a lot about a climate or a candidate. That is a very decisive issue, obviously.
Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is a $300 million a year program that funnels money to all the Great Lakes states. And it has been instrumental in cleaning up some really major pollutions sites. Michigan had 14 originally, and it's down to 10 now, and EPA is trying to push us to get half of them out by 2024. So the money has to come each year from Congress, and that means a major effort to advocate for continued funding, because once it goes, it's going to go into something else, and then we're left with these problems. And the other issue, of course, is the high water problem, especially in Lake Michigan and Huron. I don't know what's going on with Erie or the other lake east of there, but these are problems that are not being addressed right now by the federal or the state governments, and as long as this increase in level of water continues, there's going to be more and more of an outcry. So one of the problems we could face is people are going to say, well, let's take the money for Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and then our programs falter. So these are kinds of issues where we need to think, about how we can influence our congressmen, our state legislators to look at the whole picture and realize that, we're in a dynamic situation, and we need to keep an eye on the high water. We got to keep an eye on the problems that have been created over the decades, and that if we don't take care of them, we're going to have problems. And of course, we have the interplay between the AOCs, the areas of concern that are on the lake and are also suffering from the high water problem. So it just keeps ballooning all as you look at all of this stuff. Oh,
It-
Go ahead.
And you have to look carefully at their positions, and if you talk to them, ask careful questions, because all of our members of Congress, we have great bipartisan support for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. All of them are very supportive of it, but just like you said, you know, where will that money go? What will they put it towards? And you know, we definitely have some needs in addition to the GLRI. You know, Great Lakes shoreline and resiliency study is in the Water Resources Development Act, and we need that to be able to protect all of our Great Lakes shorelines. And so be careful with the questions you ask. And yeah, but most of all, vote. That's the biggest thing. Vote, make your voice heard, and vote on behalf of what is the most important to you, which hopefully is the environment and water resources.
right. Well, Evan, do you have any questions or comments on voting?
Well, I think that we've covered the important issues, and I'd just like to say that all these problems, the sooner we address them, the better. As time goes on, these things get more and more difficult to deal with. So I hope that candidates will put forth plans that will have immediate action on these issues, because that's so important.
Okay. Any further, well, let's say finishing comments from you, Jennifer.
Again, vote. That's the biggest
I mean, you don't have to say anything.
Vote.
You said it all already. So-
And again, keep in mind what you're voting for, and what the candidates represent when you vote.
Okay. Well, thank you. You know, it's been a pleasure talking with you on both the line 5 and on voting. And, you know, for me, these programs are always educational, and I get to ask questions, which is even better. So I wanted to thank you for taking time out of your evening to be with us. And let's hope that things go well for us November 3rd, and that the environment continues to be protected regardless of who's wins, and that we can, you know, make headway on our pollution issues and keep our you know, drinking water safe, which you know, I've become aware of as a major problem, you know, on the in all of our cities. So it's just amazing the number of things that need to be done, and you know, finding the funds to you know, do the work that needs to be done by them. So anyway, I will end it there and mention that we plan to have a program next week, Thursday at 7 o'clock again. This will be the Marquette Spaceport issue that's come up, and we'll be having a number of people from the group that is opposing the spaceport. And I think you'll find it fascinating, because, you know, who would think that we would want to have a major rocket port? The last one we had was on the Keweenaw, up in the Keweenaw County, and but that's only about 100 feet wide, whereas this one is going to take 5,000 acres. So big difference, and you know, many different decades since the old spaceport was started and stopped, and now we're going to try to see what we can do to help our environment out, and see where the group is going with this. So I hope you can join us next week, Thursday, 7 p.m. And we'll be sending out the press release and the link to join either via Zoom or via Facebook. So thank you again, and have a pleasant evening, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Jennifer.
Have a great night.
Yeah, good night.
Good night, everyone.